It is imperative that the Trail of Tears Association ensure that the record of what was done to the First Nations of the southeastern United States remains as relevant a story today as it was 180 years ago.
An amazing story that the people, the ancestors of the Eastern Band, purposefully enacted and saw their way all the way through all the suffering that it took to remain here.
The Cherokee wanted to create, they wanted to communicate with themselves, but most importantly, they wanted to communicate with the world.
So ancestral Cherokee people are cosmopolitan people. They had deep and wide social networks.
One disillusioned soldier wrote that he was paid to commit a crime, to defend a fraudulent treaty with, in his words, the vilest machinations man or demon could invent.
And if you understand the Trail of Tears, and if you don't forget the Trail of Tears, when you go on to study just what happened in the 19th century after the Cherokee people got to their new homelands, picked themselves back up, and rebuilt a great society and a great democracy and a government built on the rule of law.
We don't do this to shame or blame. We do it because it's an opportunity for us to say to the world, our ancestors persevered. They had tenacity and resilience. They refused to be victims. They rebuilt the Cherokee Nation.
So I think that y'all should give yourselves a round of applause for all that you've accomplished in the last 25 years.
You didn't sign up to be warriors in this battle. Your efforts to speak plainly about the Trail of Tears, to preserve the history, helps push back on this nonsense. So we are bringing back the history course for the Cherokee people, by the Cherokee people, so that this generation of Cherokees coming up will know their own history.
Thank you and good morning. Okay, I may scream help for technical assistance here in a little bit, but we'll try it. Oh, okay. Thank you. One of the things, thank you, Troy. After the Eastern Band made me an honorary member, Troy sent me his vest. I have coveted this vest for years. And he sent it. But the problem is I have to wear a jacket because some of you may be surprised, but I do have a tailor. And she was on vacation all year, so out in Colorado. So I haven't gotten this fitted yet, so. But this was going to start, well, we were going to do this 2 years ago. And so what happened, well, you know, we postponed the conference and then it postponed again. And so we kind of went through 2021, which was the bicentennial of Sequoyah actually finishing his syllabary. And so, so we've already done all this, and we're actually putting the syllabary to bed, but I'll kind of go over some of the things that we've done and we're planning to do. And so of course, a little background about Sequoyah. You know, there's certain things that that we know about Sequoyah that's carved in stone. There's places he's at. There's things that happen that we do know that happened. And then what happens is we start into the kind of the gray area where you have some exaggerations. And then you go into the tall tales. And so, and then you end up with just the blatant lies, total falsehoods. And, you know, when I'm talking with our school kids about, you know, some of these things, when you go out and go fishing and you tell your best friend about that fish you caught, it gets bigger. And so, you know, with a lot of those stories about Sequoyah, probably a real good one is where his wife burns his work. We pretty much figure, yes, she destroyed his work at some point, but she grabs his papers and throws them into the fireplace off of the table in the cabin. Or like at the Trail of Tears, he had built a little cabin out in the woods to kind of use as an office. And one day when he's not there, his wife and some neighbors go and burn it to the ground and destroy it. So to what degree? And so you kind of go weeding through it. And one of those things that I kind of hope or wish that someday, we know he kept journals. And if those journals appeared, somebody's attic or in a trunk or something, so information, we're always kind of finding more and more information. So what we believe now could change drastically if we, with research. And as Sequoia's growing up, of course, he's born near or in the village of Tuskegee. That's another one where some people refer to him being born in the village, others that he's born near the village of Tuskegee. We have to go weed through all the birth dates. A number of different places have him born in 1760 or 1765, later date 1770. We kind of believe at Sequoia that he's born around 1776, that his father's Nathaniel Gist, and Nathaniel comes down in 1775, 1776, and possibly again in 1777, because he's friends with George Washington. And Washington, knowing that the revolution's about to explode, he asked Nathaniel to go talk to the Cherokee. Now, Nathaniel had been fur trading in the Cherokee country back in the 1760s, and he had built up a very good relationship with the Cherokees. And so that's why Nathaniel was asked to go talk to the Cherokee about not coming in, allying with the British. His mother, Huerta's of the Paint clan, she gives him a traditional upbringing. He goes through the rites to be a warrior. She gives him, of course, his English name, and we could talk hours about Sequoia, or, all the variations that it could be, but basically translated generally as pig's foot. And why would we call him pig's foot? He had a physical challenge. Have you ever noticed how a pig walks? Very stiff-legged. Some say he may have had clubfoot or a deformed foot that looked like a pig's foot. I've found over 26 different reasons why Sequoia had a physical challenge. So the last one, which was last year, was that he was injured in a stickball match and his knee was crushed. And so that's the last one. The most common one is that he's wounded in a hunting accident as a boy. That's the one I came across most often, that he almost dies but gets better and has a physical challenge from then on. And then others say he was wounded at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend when he served in the United States Army. So there's some things you kind of go with your gut feeling what you believe. So as he's growing up, his family talks about Sequoia would build little houses, and he would put details like real houses, and just people were amazed at what he would do with these little buildings. He started drawing pictures, and one said he drew the best bison than anybody ever could draw. It looked exactly like it. You could recognize the person that he drew their face. You could recognize that person. So he's very talented. He teaches himself to silversmith to make jewelry, gorgets, armlets, rings, necklaces, and then and one of the things, he spends a period of his time that basically does enough work to get a keg of liquor and starts the party. And then when the party's over, he would sober up and do enough work to get another keg of liquor, and it would start again. And then as the family and friends said, one day he just walked away from alcohol, never touched it again. And so my background's criminal justice. And so I've always kind of looking for little pieces of evidence. And to me, this shows he's a really strong individual. This being in the late 18th century, early 19th century, there's no Alcoholics Anonymous, there's no social services, there's no Dr. Phil to turn to. And with him is maybe a friend or a family, he walks away from alcohol, never touches it again. So a very strong-willed human. And then he learns to blacksmith. And so to kind of back off or take off on the side story, you know, one of the stories is that you hear is Sequoyah, while he's serving in the Army during the war, the Creek War, that he sees the officers writing orders down on a piece of paper. And he gets to thinking about it. Well, we could do that. We could put, you know, our language, we could create a way of putting our words on paper. And so he began, typically it's this War of the Creek War in 1814. But it actually goes back to when does Sequoyah announce it? And he announces in 1809 in his blacksmith shop, we could create a writing system. And so that's one of those, you know, stories that's gotten exaggerated. People don't realize or don't remember or think about the Tellico Blockhouse. He's living 1.25 miles from the Tellico Blockhouse. And so this is where he would have seen the soldiers writing down, Captain Smith, take your company to the forks of the river on Thursday at 12. And Thursday at 12, there's 100 men standing there with Captain Smith because that little piece of paper told him to. And so this is where I believe the spark starts for Sequoyah, is at the blockhouse. The blockhouse is actually originally built in 1794 and is active up until 1807. And then there's actually some guys just hanging out there until 1811. But in the beginning, it was set up to run patrols to make sure that no whites were sneaking in and encroaching on Cherokee land. And so they were running the patrols out from there. And if you had business to conduct in the nation with one of the Cherokee, you came there to get a passport or pass to go into the nation, conduct your business, and then you would come back out from the blockhouse. And later on, as the Americanization program with Thomas Jefferson, the factory was added on, which was the cabin in the back part of the building, or in the back part of the fort. And that was a trading post. It was a technical place to teach women, Cherokee women, how to spin and weave, make butter and cheese, animal husbandry, cash crops. And so that's going on in the factory. And then off of that lower left side of the blockhouse, it's a little hill. Right up that little hill was a blacksmith shop. And Brett could probably give more and better information about, he did some research on the number of Cherokees. Was it 8 or 10 Cherokees that learned to blacksmith there at the blockhouse? So Sequoyah would have been one of those Cherokees that learned to blacksmith there. And so to me, this is a very important site for Sequoyah, for the Cherokee, because of that spark. So this is the Fort Loudon State Historic Area. They've actually started reconstructing one of the blockhouses in the blockhouse. It's actually finished now, and they're actually chinking it. And so we're hoping to be able to do some living history over there in the near future. So. This is our blacksmith shop at Sequoyah Birthplace, and somebody may have to watch me and time me because I may run too many tangents today. But one of the happiest days at Sequoyah Birthplace for me was when Max Ramsey, the chairman, a lot of you folks may remember Max, gave me permission and said, yes, you can go build a blacksmith shop. I'm like, wow. So, and why did we build a blacksmith shop? Because Sequoyah became a blacksmith. And because it was as I mentioned, in 1809, there's a group of Cherokees standing in the shop, and Sequoyah says, hey, we could create a writing system. We could put our words on paper. And I think he uses, one of the examples that I've read is he kind of like scribbles something on a piece of paper, just marks, and he kind of says, I could write down what I'm thinking right now and lay it right here, go away, come back 2 years later and pick it up. And I can remember what I was thinking 2 years ago. So it's in the blacksmith shop that he begins, makes the announcement. And that's one of the great places for me, because I actually blacksmithed my way through I blacksmithed my way through college at Western with David Bruin, if anybody knows David. And so that's one of the best places to think. You gotta, when you're just having to beat a piece of metal to make a big piece of metal into a little piece of metal, it's good thinking time and stress release. This is where it also is kind of changing. The culture's changing for the Cherokees because of the Americanization program, going from the Cherokee culture of hunters, warriors. The men's roles are changing, women's roles are changing. And so at this point, in the early occupations that Sequoia worked with his mother in her trading post. She took over the, I guess, Nathaniel's trading post and continued to run it, and he worked for her in the trading post. And so all these occupations before, if you like the silver ring, well, that's $10. You only have 8, come back and see me when you've got 10. You want this trade gun, that's 36 deer hides, you've got 34, go kill 2 more deer, skin them out, tan them out, come back and see me when you've got 36. So everything's cash on the barrelhead. But now it's an occupation of necessity. If you're out plowing in your field and your plow breaks, you need it fixed today so you can finish plowing, sow your crop, raise your crop, harvest your crop, and take it to market. And by the way, Sequoia, I spent all my money on seed. I don't have any money. I can't pay you today. And so here's the problem. He can't remember what people owe him for the work that he does. And so what Sequoia does is he develops a numbering system. So the top part over there is the numbering system. The first row is 1 through 20. The second row is 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. And then if you go to the fourth row is 1,000. And the very last, kind of at the bottom middle of the page, is 1 million. And so you would basically take, like you could take the symbol for 30 and then add whatever number to make it 36 or 37. You could take, and like the 1 million there in the middle bottom of the page, if you wanted 31 million, you take the symbol for 30, put it in front of the 1, symbol for 1, 31 million. So this was at the Gilcrease Museum, the original, and this is reported to be of Sequoia's own hand, and he signed it. And so you can kind of read, this is what I was kind of alluding to earlier about Sequoia, so like 2 S's, because he signed it with 4 syllables. But Sequoia is 3 syllables. So, and that leads into discussions about his name being changed to Principal Bird or Sparrow or the Crane. So there's also a number of different names that have popped up. So he uses this numbering system, and according to what I've read, is he would draw your picture of your face, and then out beside of it make your mark for whatever you owed him. And so it was an accounting system to remember. So then he spends, he starts in 1809, he finishes in 1821, 12 years in trying to create this writing system. And we know he tries different types of systems like hieroglyphics, and he kind of realizes very quickly if he can't remember all these little symbols that he's making, then the people would never learn them and never use them. And so he goes on, and there's a number of different stories of how he comes up with the syllabary. My personal favorite is listening to the birds sing. And one day it just kind of, well, what if I break it down to the sound of the language? And, just as a result of listening to the song of the birds and hearing repetitive sounds. And then I'll break it down. So originally he finds 87 sounds, and he gives 87 symbols that he kind of creates in his own mind by his own hand. And when it comes to Sequoia, that statement I just made, there's always an exception. If you notice up there, what is it, the second line, first symbol? What's that? Am I pointing the right one? Yeah, second line, first symbol. So he must have seen a sheet music. So there's other symbols that do resemble other things like an H or a 6 or whatever, but these symbols didn't exist. They came out of his own mind by his own hand. And then let's see. So this is finished in 1821, and so almost immediately it's adopted by the Cherokee Nation as the official writing system for the Cherokee. And so soon after that, the nation wants to buy a printing press to create a newspaper. And so Elias Boutnot is actually put in charge of going out to find and buy this printing press. Well, very quickly he finds out that they can't afford to buy the printing press. Those symbols don't exist. And so you would have to make the matrix to make all the type. Plus you have to have type, thousands and thousands of type to be able to print a newspaper or a book. And so, so the problem is they can't afford it. Well, it's Elias Boutnot, probably Reverend Samuel Wooster, and even the letter foundry where the type was made adapts and changes Sequoia's symbols. And we'll talk a little more about that in just in a second here. So Elias Boutnot finds the Union Acorn printing press. The Union Acorn press is the first slide there on the far side. And so Dr. Dwayne King and I, back when we were starting to do the renovations, and we were doing the charrettes talking about, the new museum. And, we certainly, the old museum, how many visited the old museum? How many have been to the new museum? So the old museum was really heavily archaeology based, and we didn't really tell a very good story of Sequoia or the Syllabary. And so that was one of the things that we did in the new exhibit, was focusing more on Sequoia's life and what he did, and the Syllabary. And then one of the things that I had learned over the years I've been at Sequoia is fourth graders have no concept how a book was printed 150, 200 years ago. Their laser printer, hit a button, and out it is. And it's amazing. It's one of those cool little things when I'm telling the story of Sequoia, and you see, like, even first graders, they get it. And then you start talking about a printing press and a type, and they're trying to wrap their mind around the fact that the type, all that in one book or on that newspaper page begins with one little piece of lead type. And so that was one of the things we talked about. And so we started looking for a Union Acorn press, and Dr. King and I found two, but they were in museums, and of course those museums wouldn't let us touch them. But we came across this gentleman, Mr. Jacobson, and Mr. Jacobson was a collector up in New Jersey. And he said, well, you'll never find a Union Acorn press, but he says, I happen to have an 1833 Otis Tufts Acorn printing press. And so I keep saying printing press, but what's the other word? Acorn. You see it? It's a little hard in those pictures. The Union press is not as defined an acorn, but ours, the Otis Tufts, is, when you look at it, you can definitely see that acorn shape. They're the same technology. It's the exact same equipment. Our press at Sequoia is 7 years newer, but it operates the exact same way the Union press did. And so in doing demonstrations for the general public, kids, that's something I never expected 20 years ago, that I'd be wanting and enjoying working on a printing press. So what has to happen when we kind of go back to, we go back here, our exhibit lady, Lynn Henley, she put in this new font, which I really wish she had put the traditional font on that particular panel. But it's also kind of good because, the new fonts are coming out and things are changing. And it's kind of also a little bit confusing because some of the symbols, I was having to double check those symbols in the different fonts. But to make all of those, see, if you look at Sequoia's, they're very thin and cursive. And if they had sat down to make the matrix, it was like the mold to cast the type, it would be very thin lines. And so it's more complicated. And what would also happen is the type would wear out a whole lot faster. Brian Baker that has helped me with the printing press. He was in Knoxville. He's now down in Atlanta, but he is a printing press guru. And he was just one day was sitting looking at that, and he said, I can give you another reason why they didn't use Sequoia's Syllabary is it's too thin, because it would have worn out a whole lot quicker than the more bold, solid type that it becomes. And so if you look at the two, Sequoia symbol becomes a symbol we recognize. There's a number of symbols we recognize. There's actually Greek symbols, there's German symbols, there's, and it's turned sideways. If you turned it to the line was on top, that's the symbol for the Tejas, who were the Mexicans that supported Texas independence. And so that symbol existed. And you could just take, and like if you notice, there's an upside down 4. There's other upside down letters. Just a way of making it look different. And so there's a few symbols that are in there that exist nowhere else in the world. And so to me, that makes it uniquely Cherokee. So that's why we end up having the syllabary. I kind of hear people differentiating between Sequoia syllabary and the Cherokee syllabary or the printing press syllabary. So. And so once the type is produced, this is how it came. And I'm like, I was afraid to touch it. I didn't know what to do. And so fortunately I'd found Brian, and I actually took a class up at his print shop in Knoxville. And then Brian started coming down once a week, and we started this was in 2021. And the first thing I'm showing him the bricks. And at one point, I'd pulled out one of it's one of the knockoffs from Reverend Samuel Wooster did a syllabary chart with a pronunciation guide, and there's a couple of them that are floating out there. And anyhow, I was showing him the chart, sort of like this one, and Brian goes over to the type drawer and he looks at the type drawer, and then he comes back over and he counts the syllabary, and then he's like, "Oh, no problem, we can fix this. If you got one of these, I can cut up." And I'm like, "Well, sure, you can cut that one up." So we get him a pair of scissors. He starts cutting them all out and then gluing them on cardboard. And then he glued the little pieces of cardboard into the type cabinet. And so with all of that jumble, that I guess we should call this a syllabary soup, you cut those strings, and then you just have to sit there and hunt and peck, finding the symbol and putting it in the right drawer. And so as you can kind of see there, and so I'm in the process of doing research, and Jack Baker sent me this book, and this was a great book. So if you have any questions, want to learn more about the newspapers, talk to Will or visit this book. So I was actually going through there, and it talks about Reverend Wooster did this chart to organize their type drawer. So we were just following in their footsteps and didn't know it. And so once we got this organized, and what you kind of do, the process is you start with, whatever your notes or whatever you want to print. And then this was something for months, I cannot remember the name of this, a composing stick. And so you could actually set this up for whatever your column size is, and you would go over to your type drawer and you would start pulling, your Cherokee syllabary, your English. You would start and work about 3 or 4 lines at a time, and then you would go transfer that over to what's called a chase, a metal frame, or you could put it right onto the press. And even if you notice, the name of them has slipped my mind, coppers and brass. Those little, you can see the copper and brass. One of the things that when you're setting the type, it cannot move or shift at all. If the type does bend over a little bit, and as you're pressing, it's going to flatten out one side, and so you've ruined that piece of type. So you have to lock everything in. So even a blank space, there's spacing material there. So everything is completely full on that sheet. Let's see. Now, this is something else that most of you may know this already, but for you to read this, the type is backwards. So it may be hard to see, but this is a plate. And so for you to read this, you would like set your type, you place it in a press, you would put your paper on it, put your ink on it, put your paper on it, press it, crank it back out, peel this off, and now you can read it. So that's one of those cool things when the fourth graders go, ooh. So that's one of the things, and we were organizing the type drawers, and it kind of hit me one day. A small case B is a D, and a small case D is a B. A P is a Q, and a Q is a P. And when I got that in my mind, I could start seeing them backwards then. So, let's see. So what we wanted to do, of course, Sequoia's syllabary is his syllabary out of his own mind by his own hand. And so to commemorate, am I out of town? Okay, well, it's not a website, it's a video on this. Okay. And I'm almost there. So this syllabary was actually created by Reverend Wooster, but we ended up putting the information and things like that on there, and then going through the translations. We first started doing printing. We just kind of would get some phrases, and I would talk to one speaker, reader, writer, speaker of Cherokee, and so I then found out that the Eastern Band Council had passed a resolution that anything in the syllabary has to go before 3 reader, writer, speakers. So anyhow, we got that on track and started working with a number of folks, Lou and my mind went blank, to actually get all of this proofed and making sure that the syllabary was correct. One of the kind of interesting stories I came across is apparently Isaac Harris, I don't know what to call him, probably troublemaker. He basically started a rumor that it was Reverend Samuel Wooster was the driving force of the Cherokee Phoenix. And so he started that going around. But there's a very good proof that is a big tall tale, because who remembers what happens to Reverend Samuel Wooster? There were 12 men arrested because they wouldn't swear allegiance to the state of Georgia and the governor. And all of them decide to leave except for Reverend Wooster and one other gentleman. And so Reverend Wooster is arrested, tried, and sent to hard labor in prison because he wouldn't sign the oath of allegiance. And of course that goes to Wooster versus Georgia, and we know how that goes. And so he's in prison. The whole time Reverend Wooster is gone, the editorials don't change, the style doesn't change. It's Elias Bootnott, who is the editor of the paper, and he's the one that's creating the Cherokee Phoenix. Reverend Wooster would, typically his job was translating a chapter in the Bible. And so he would actually come in, and being the son of a printer, I think he had a little bit to do with helping set type. And I think he would help actually do the type for the translation. And there was the story, he was had learned Cherokee, had been down at Brainerd Mission, but he was working on a phonetic Cherokee writing system, but he hears about what this Cherokee had just created, the syllabary, and he drops everything that he had done, and comes and learns Sequoia's Syllabary. And so with the goal of being able to translate the Bible into Cherokee. So the final days, he actually migrates out west, and they say he had stomach cancer, but he would still come into the print shop and he would stretch out and set type because it was most comfortable just to lay in the floor stretched out, setting type. So this is something that one of the ways I try to engage people from up in Knoxville is, you know, the Cherokee Phoenix was actually, well, let me back up a little bit. The press was shipped out of Boston by ship down to Savannah. Then it comes up the river to Augusta, Georgia. And then the Cherokee go down and pick up the printing press and the type down in Augusta and transport it up by wagon. And so they get the press into New Echota by January of 1828. And but they didn't have any paper. And so what happens is, I come across this in several different sources. They come to Knoxville, Tennessee to buy their paper. Well, Brian Baker was the tech guy at McKay's Books in Knoxville. Anybody familiar with McKay's Books in Knoxville? What road's it on? Paper mill. I'm like, this is a historical story that is just forming, that is going to be so great. And so, you know, Brian is on paper mill, and so I looked 3 or 4 times because they said there was a site that had a sign that said Historic Paper Mill, original site. And so I hunted and hunted, couldn't find it. Finally, Brian found it, and so we came up to Knoxville and met at one of the art stores and bought paper and rolled it up. And I followed him over, and as soon as we parked, I jumped out. I handed him my phone, and I ran up to the sign. And so Brian took the picture, and then I handed Brian the paper, and he went and stood in front of the sign. Then I looked up at it and went, oh, man. The Cherokee Phoenix shut down in 1834. Shot that story up. But anyhow, so, but that leads to... I was actually discussing with Joe Emmerich, who was involved with the East Tennessee Historical Society, and so Joe comes up with some information. Apparently there were a number of paper mills in and around Knoxville, and so that was where they would come to get the paper. And they had, the Phoenix was to be a weekly newspaper, and they typically had problems in getting it out weekly. Kind of in the very beginning, it was unpredictable mail. One of the things that they would do is they would take other newspapers and they would pull stories as fillers from those other newspapers and trying to get the newspapers out to other people. There was a story where one of the riders fell off his horse in the river. He was saved immediately, but the dispatch bag took 7 hours to find. And the postmaster had written back to Elias Bootnott asking for the addresses because apparently the addresses that the newspapers were going to had washed off. But he had unrolled all the papers and they were drying, so he just needed their addresses. So the mail was one of the early problems that they had. Another big problem that they had was when one of the staff would get sick. And so if one of the staff got sick, they couldn't get all the type, set. And then they would run out of ink. And typically they would go down to Augusta, Georgia to pick up the ink. And then the other thing, they would run out of paper. And so they would come up to Knoxville, Tennessee to get their paper. So yes. Okay, that's where I was. Okay. So this is the print of Sequoia that was done from the painting that when he visited Washington, D.C. in 1828. And this was the print that came off of it. And this is my belief that that is the closest likeness to Sequoia that's his likeness. So I know there's multiple stories on that. But one of the things to kind of wrap up the paper, and I've been at Sequoia birthplace for 22 years, and most of the things I had read was about the Cherokees wanting to communicate as a nation by creating the Cherokee Phoenix. And as I got into reading more about Elias Bootnott and more about the paper, you know, Elias Bootnott and the Cherokee wanted to create, they wanted to communicate with themselves, but most importantly, they wanted to communicate with the world, to get the word out of what's going on. You know, and I remember, you know, there were the very traditional Cherokees that kind of thought Sequoyah was insane for even trying to create this. And then I remember Brett doing a program when we were here the last time we were in Cherokee, about there were pockets of Cherokee here in North Carolina that were just learning to read the syllabary in the early 1830s. Almost 10 years later, they're learning to read, and they're learning to read so they can read what's happening with the removal, to find out what's going on with removal. So thank you all for letting me run my mouth for a while and get up here and be technically dumb, but thank you, and if there's any questions or anything.